Welcome to Born Curious, coming to you from Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm Evelisa Strada, your co-host.
And I'm your co-host, Heather Min. Today we are releasing 2 episodes simultaneously because both are conversations about issues related to the Middle East.
As part of Radcliffe's initiative on academic freedom, we're inviting leading experts to the Institute to explore the complex interplay of academic freedom and connecting across difference. If you've not yet listened to episode 402, we encourage you to listen to that conversation as well.
In today's second episode, we're featuring a Radcliffe-hosted conversation about modern Jewish identity in the context of university, local, and worldwide communities and events. The occasion for this conversation was the release of Noah Feldman's book, To Be a Jew Today, a New Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People.
Feldman, who is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, sat down with his law school colleague and our dean, Tomiko Brown-Nagin, to discuss themes from the book.
We will open with a few remarks from David Stern, a professor of Jewish literature at Harvard and a former Radcliffe Institute fellow. Let's dive in.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Stern. I'm a professor of Jewish literature in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences here at Harvard and a former Radcliffe Institute fellow, and it's wonderful to be back here. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Morden S. Waldvogel Memorial Fund, which is supporting this event, as well as the co-sponsorship of the Harvard Law School Library. These programs are offered in the spirit of constructive discourse and to model the importance of connecting across differences. And now to our discussion. This past year has been a protracted moment of inflection for American Jews at Harvard and across this entire country, not to mention abroad. And that moment of inflection, while not its explicit subject, certainly makes all the more urgent the many issues that Professor Noah Feldman explores in his recent acclaimed book, To Be a Jew Today, a New Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People. I'm not even going to try to list Professor Feldman's many accomplishments. That would take the rest of the afternoon. In addition to his most recent book that I've just mentioned, he has authored 9 other nonfiction books and 2 textbooks on constitutional law. I'll just conclude by saying that I've known Noah since he was 6 years old, and it's been wonderful watching him grow up to become an adult. Tomiko Brown-Nagin is Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute and the Daniel P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School and a Professor of History in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. An award-winning legal historian, it's now my great pleasure to invite Professors Tomiko Brown-Nagin and Noah Feldman to the stage.
I am delighted to be in conversation with you, Noah Feldman, who is, of course, my admired colleague, about his wonderful book, To Be a Jew Today. I have my own copy here. I love the colors. It's highly recommended. And I also want to highly recommend the audiobook. I want to start with what motivated you to write the book. Who do you hope reads it, and what do you hope they will take away from your book?
Before I answer, can I just thank you, Tomiko, for having me here. Thank you to Radcliffe. I wrote this book really for 2 different kinds of reasons. One of them is the kind of more familiar reason to express in an academic environment, which is that I've always been engaged alongside my constitutional law work and my Islamic studies work in deep study of Jewish materials, historical and contemporary. And for the last 10 or 12 years, I've also run a reading group at Harvard Law School, which then blossomed into a whole program that is on Jewish law and evaluates different thematic topics in Jewish law. Every semester we start with the ancient materials and work our way all the way up to the contemporary world. So I've been thinking a lot about it, and I realized that I had something I wanted to say. And the great thing about being an academic is when you have something you really want to say, you try to write a book about it, and somebody will read it, then you've done your job somehow. But that's the really more conventional reason. The deeper reason had to do with life stage. My kids were getting to the point where I could begin to foresee them going off to college. One started at college this fall, the other is a senior in high school. And I was just really struck that their experiences in university with respect to their Jewishness were just going to be so remarkably different than mine had been at a distance in time that sometimes feels like it was a long time ago, but also sometimes feels like it was yesterday. And it made me reflect on what had changed. And I thought there's some intersection between what I want to say in this book and how much I think the world of contemporary Jewish experience and life has shifted over, say, roughly the last 35 or 40 years. And that was the other real impetus to try to write a book. Not that I'm not naive enough to think my kids will read this book, but who knows, maybe grandchildren someday. But that generationally, there would be people who were grappling with the question. And I will just say, I chose the title of the book a little bit advisedly this way. It's called To Be a Jew Today. And for me, and probably for everybody in the audience, if you say to be, that implies or not to be. Mm-hmm. And that was intentional, because I think that there's been a lot of time historically where the question of whether you wanted to be a Jew or not was a very irrelevant question if you happened to have been born Jewish. It was still relevant if you weren't born Jewish and were considering whether to become Jewish, but if you were born Jewish, it just seemed automatic, perhaps assigned. Maybe you were just thrown existentially into this status, and you were stuck with it. And I don't think that's what it feels like to the great majority of young Jews today, who really do have the option of just walking away from it. It could be gently. It doesn't have to be in anger. And just saying, yeah, no, that's not part of who I am. And I think that is a very remarkable reality, and it's one of the things I wanted to explore.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow up on the last part of what you said about younger Jews who have the option of not identifying in that way. So does that happen, or did it happen in the class that you teach at the law school? That is, were people not only engaging with the scholarship, but with personal identity itself?
Yes, I think partly because of the flexibility that you have in a reading group, which is structured like a seminar rather than like a big formal lecture class, people are capable of being pretty personal. And I encourage that within bounds.
Right.
We have some colleagues at the law school who give out detailed instructions at the beginning of the semester explaining they don't want to hear anybody talking about their own individuality at all. And I respect that as a reasonable way to focus on the legal materials. But in this course, I don't do it that way. In fact, I usually begin every semester by asking for people's reflections on the theme in light of their own experiences. And that ended up coming through for me in the book as well. It's by far the most personal book I've ever written. And in some passages, I even found myself at the last section of each part of the 3 parts of the book, even talking about quasi-theological matters that I've never thought of even possibly reducing to writing. But I made myself do it because I realized on writing it, my first draft didn't have any of that in it.
Really?
And then I realized that there was something missing, and what was missing was what I really thought. And usually in an academic book, you should talk about what you think, but you probably shouldn't talk that much about what you feel. It's an academic book. But in this book, I crossed that boundary because I decided that part of the answer to what it means to be a Jew has to do with feeling. It has to do with the phenomenology of what it feels like and what you want it to feel like.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to the question of the memoir aspects of this book, but first I want to return to the theme that David mentioned about this having been such a difficult year. You actually finished most of the writing of your book before the atrocities of October 7th and the ensuing war. And I wonder if you made any changes to the manuscript in the aftermath of October 7th and all that's happened since.
I thought I was done with the book, and I even had the bound galley which for those of you in the audience who are authors is the kind of physical object that tells you, you did it. You know, everything but the typos is fixed. You know, that's the theory. And that came in the first week of October. And the original title of the book was a bit lighthearted because I had thought to myself, I'm going to make this a little bit more of a personal book. I can afford to have a sense of humor. And so the working title, which appears on the bound galley, which maybe is a collector's item now, is Bad Jew. That was going to be the title. So the first thing that I realized was that that was not going to be the title of the book subsequently, and that the time for lightheartedness had passed. And then in the immediate aftermath of October 7, and then really over the next 3 months, I reworked the material in the book in a very intense way. I was also teaching 9 credits. And I did it in such a way that the core argument of the book remained unchanged, but many examples of things that I was trying to prove or demonstrate weirdly became easier to prove or demonstrate. And I'll give you an example. One of the claims of the book is that one of the big changes in contemporary Jewish life in the US, but also elsewhere, is that it has become impossible to be Jewish at this moment and say when the topic of Israel arises, I have no comment.
Right.
You know, I'm neither for nor against nor conflicted. It's just not central to my personal, spiritual, religious, or cultural life. And that didn't used to be the case. As a historical matter, through much of Jewish history, even since the rise of the State of Israel, it was possible to say, well, yeah, I'm Jewish, but Israel's not my big thing. I'm super religious, and so that's my thing. Or I'm a cultural Jew, or I'm a socialist Jew. I don't have a dog in the fight of Zionism. And I think that's almost impossible now, and we see that. We see that people are relating to their Jewishness with regard to Israel, including people for whom that's all about distancing themselves from Israel or engaging in critique, or even more than critique, rejection of Israel. That's also a mode of their Jewish expression. So that's one thing that I was able to demonstrate my point much more powerfully after October 7 than I would have before. The other thing that I really worked on was the theme of trauma. Because I don't think it's possible to make sense, certainly of Jewish reactions to the events of October 7, and also in some complex way to Jewish reactions to the Gaza war that followed, without taking account of how intergenerational trauma shapes Jewish responses and has shaped Jewish responses to this kind of tragedy. And it's not a simple thing just to say that there's trauma. That's the starting point, not the ending point, and I try to explore the ways that it played out in the book. But it's almost the dominant strand, I think, for a lot of people who looked at, the scenes of October 7 and could only see the Holocaust and pogroms. And I think it's important to understand that, to see where it's coming from, to be empathetic to that response, and also to observe the ways in which not everybody has that same set of intergenerational traumatic responses. For Palestinians, in the aftermath of the Gaza war, the intergenerational trauma is the trauma of Nakba, right. And that's a different trauma, and then those traumas are intersecting, and that intersection is part of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's get to the way in which you divide the book. There are 3 sections: God, country, and family. I'm very curious about the craft of writing a book, because I am myself engaged in that now and have been in the past. I'm curious how you landed on that particular structure and how it relates to the overall argument in the book.
Well, you're a very beautiful narrative writer in addition to being a scholarly writer. I'm always working on my narrative craft. It's work for me. And this book wasn't going to be a pure narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end of the story. Mm-hmm. So it had to be thematic in some sense. And the way I hit on this structure was by asking, what do I really care about in writing the book? What's really motivating me to write the book? And what was motivating me was a simple question. which is, why be a Jew? With the open possibility that the answer is, yeah, you know what? There isn't a good enough reason to be a Jew. Enough. Not going to do that. And seen from that perspective, I really wanted to start with spirituality, with the divine, because it's almost I don't want to say the dirty secret, but it's almost the secret aspect of contemporary Jewish life that even people who think of themselves as very religious, if you ask them, why are you Jewish or what makes you Jewish, don't start with, well, these are my beliefs and these are my commitments. And that's honestly very strange. And by the way, I include myself fully in that. And that was one of the reasons that it struck me that I should start with that, because it wasn't obvious to me to start with it. And then, I thought to myself, if you're going to organize your life in some way around this connection and commitment, surely what you believe should have something to do with it, maybe a lot to do with it. So I started there. Then I moved on to the country, the Israel section, because of, as I was saying, I think maybe the most original claim in the book is that for a lot of Jews, Israel has come to be the answer to the question, why be a Jew? That's a very perennial question. For the last 2,000 years, Jews have been asking themselves, why be a Jew in some form or another? Or why practice? Maybe they knew they were Jews, but they wondered why practice as Jews. And they had many different kinds of answers, from Jewish mysticism to rational Jewish philosophy, to a certain kind of commitment to the Bible. And the idea that the answer to why be a Jew is there's a national entity that I feel committed to, a nation state and a nation that I feel committed to, is a distinctively modern answer to that question in certain ways. And so I really wanted to focus on that. That's the big central part of change. And then the last part, which is about family, came from something that ended up, it kind of snuck up on me as my second biggest argument in the book. And I want to ask you, Tomiko, about your views about this too, but let me just say to the audience what it is. That's the idea that if you think about what are the Jews as a people, the best answer for me is that the Jews are a large, loving, somewhat dysfunctional family. And I mean family in the contemporary sense of family, which includes descent, but also includes all sorts of imagined and chosen relations. That include joining by choice, joining because you married someone who was Jewish, joining because Jewishness is in your cultural space. And much like regular families, we don't clearly delineate the boundaries of who's our family. I mean, if you ask yourself, just do the thought experiment and ask yourself, who is in my family? It's very hard to have a definitive answer then and say, would all of the people that I think are in my family also think that we're in the same family? Also not clear. It's contestable and contested. The borders aren't so clear. We don't even have names for lots of the parts of our contemporary families. I mean, so I use an example, a real example in the book. We don't have an easy word in English for my ex-wife's husband's mother. But I have a really good relationship with my ex-wife's husband's mother, who's completely lovely. She's like an extra bonus Jewish grandmother to my kids. I sit across from her at Passover. I mean, there should be some word for that other than the mouthful. And that's, to me, an example of what contemporary families, are like. In no way can it be said that I chose her to be in my family or that she chose me to be in her family, but that's how it came out. So that's why I end with the family part, because I think it is the sort of most telling. And so I actually wanted to ask you, in your own thinking and experience around Jewishness, which I know has been very rich and interesting, how you think about the family aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I love the metaphor. I love the idea of accentuating that Judaism is a big tent, certainly can be a big tent, and many of us would say should be a big tent. And thank you for the opportunity to reflect on my own experience. Speaking of family, the first thing I should say, honoring my mother and father, is that everything they taught me about how to be a good person in some ways was refracted to their own religious experience, which was in the Black Baptist Church in the South, and that is the tradition in which I grew up. It was a tradition that, as it turned out, had a lot in common in terms of values with the tradition that I started to follow about 15 years ago after, so I will be married to my husband, who's Jewish, 30 years next spring. And so it was actually well after we were married that I started to follow Reform Judaism. And so it really wasn't about the marriage itself. It really was about the attraction to the concept that the Torah is a living document, that it has to or should, in my view, accommodate modernity, accommodate liberal values. I also was very interested in the notion of repairing the world. And so for me, as I became an adult, I explored and I landed on this tradition that's very meaningful to me. And in part because my husband's family has been my family for some 30 years now. And so I'm just deeply invested in and a part of a big loving family where there are various degrees of interest in and practice of Jewish ritual.
Can I say just something, just to follow up on that? I mean, it's a really interesting point that you made about the overlap between a Black Baptist church upbringing and a Reformed Jewish worldview today. Progressive Jewishness, which I would count Reformed Judaism as part of, and large parts of conservative Judaism and Reconstructionist Judaism, was deeply influenced in America by the civil rights movement, by King, and by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So much so that I would say that the social justice values that they all very strongly stood for became de facto the core credo of contemporary progressive Judaism. So it's not just an accidental overlap. There's some causal influence there too.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So in the section of the book where you talk about progressive iterations of Jewishness, you mentioned the photograph. Do you want to say what?
Yeah, there's a famous photograph, you can look it up online, of civil rights marchers, and in the front are, in this line are household names to us. Dr. King is there, Ralph Abernathy is there, Ralph Bunch happened to be there that day, and then there's a nun, whom this is I will never make any meaningful contribution to the history of the civil rights movement, I'm certain, but in this case I did some digging and I identified the nun. This photograph is constantly reproduced and no one ever mentions her. They say a nun. I wasn't very satisfied with that. And I guess it was COVID and I was like, this is a rabbit hole I want to go down. Her name is Sister Mary Leoline. And I've got a little bio of her there. And then Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is the kind of the dean, if you will, of progressive American Jewish thought, though originally born and educated in Europe. And this picture is it's the icon of progressive American Judaism because it attaches, most of those people there were, long-term participants in the civil rights movement. Right. He was flown in for this event. I think we should be clear about that, though his values were strong and he was trying to be an ally. But that moment captures the self-embraced worldview of progressive Judaism, and it's constantly reproduced. You can see it by people nodding in the audience. Almost everybody has seen this picture, and it means something. And it's their struggle, and he is sort of lending a kind of aura to his own position of commitment to the prophetic message of justice, of social justice, really.
That's right. Although I do want to mention that there were many, many Jews who were on the ground involved in the civil rights movement, although you're right, for that photograph, it's a drop-in, but we should be clear about that bit of history.
Tons of the freedom riders, absolutely. A bunch of our colleagues at the law school actually were there.
Really?
Yeah, Martha Field was there, Betsy Bartlett was there, yeah.
I know about Betsy.
Yeah.
No one ever told me.
Yeah, Martha was there.
I would be interested in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's academic life.
That's right. So I do want to mention, Noah, since we're talking about this link between values, that my primary identity is actually as a bridge builder between and among various traditions, not only the tradition in which I grew up and Judaism, but also particularly being a leader in higher education at an institution that is so beautifully diverse. And I'm talking about Harvard, but also Radcliffe. I think it's really important to validate and respect all traditions, and that is where I live. All faith traditions, all backgrounds, nationalities, ethnicities. And I do want to say very strongly that the faith traditions that I followed and that I follow very much are respectful of all people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. You changed the terminology. Why did you do that?
So as you probably all know, the standard terminology for talking about at least American Jewish life is denominational, kind of on the model of Protestant denominationalism. So you've got Orthodox, maybe ultra-Orthodox if you call it that, or Haredi, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Jewish renewal if you're really going into the, the cutting edge. And I deliberately eschewed that terminology in favor of the categories of what I call traditionalist Judaism, which is basically the belief that God gave Moses the Torah on Mount Sinai, and with that came the instruction manual, came a guide as to who's in charge, and the answer was that the rabbis are in charge, and there's an unbroken tradition, and you're bound by that tradition. Then what I called, on the other side, progressive Judaism, which believes that the core divine message is a message of social justice, and that human beings should update their understanding of what God requires of us by our best efforts to be progressive in our thinking about social justice. And so we expand to include feminism, and we expand to include gay rights and trans rights, and this is a seamless and appropriate part of the tradition, demanded by our commitment to the spiritual or the divine. And then in between, what I call evolutionist Judaism, which is the idea that, yes, the word came from God on Sinai, but the job of interpreting that word, though it is binding on us, is a human job. And so we have to interpret it with an eye to the tradition, but also to changing values. And then last but not least, what I call the godless, which includes a wide range of points of view, from Bagels and Lox Judaism to classical Zionism, which was not very concerned with God, in fact wanted to displace God, to diasporist views, a whole range of possible views. And the reason that I changed that up is that I wanted to ask not where do you belong, but what do you think? And it's funny how just like that slight shift changes one's experience of Jewishness. Because where you belong, it's a very important sociological fact, and the sociologist should be focused on it, but I'm not a sociologist. I'm interested more in ideas and experiences, and I think ideas and experiences are connected to, again, the why be a Jew. It would be a strange thing to say, why am I a Jew? Because I belong to this temple. That's getting it backwards. Why do you belong to that temple? In theory, because it, in some way doing so corresponds to what you believe and how you want to express your life choices.
Mm-hmm. So there are
or not belong to a temple.
Yeah, there are layers and layers of emphasis in your book on the complexity of Jewish experience, the multiplicity, the big tent. But you argue that there is a unifying Jewish theological worldview, which you suggest is predicated on striving, struggling, and contending with God. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that theology and how it's key to your overall perspective on being a Jew.
Thank you for asking me that. For me, as probably everybody in the room knows, one of the great ways that Jews interact with Scripture and with text is Midrash. And Midrash, as it happens, David is probably the world's greatest living academic authority, definitely the world's greatest living academic authority on Midrash. And as David has written, Midrash does not have a simple English translation. And I'm not going to try to state it, but it includes a interpretive, conscious liberty-taking with the text. You're not asking what's the original meaning of the text. You're not asking what does it mean in context. You're asking how can I develop the text in a way to give it meaning for the moment. So my own Midrash, and anyone can do it. You can do it at home. And my Midrash, to help explain what Jewishness ultimately is, for me at least, starts with the story in the Bible in which Jacob gets the name Israel. And he gets that, as you know, after a long night of struggling or wrestling with a being who was alternately described as an angel, a man, or a god, depending on which biblical text you're looking at. And in the end, Jacob seems to win the struggle and demands a blessing from the angel. This is also an amazing scene in Angels in America, rather. And I will not let thee go unless thou bless me. And he gets this blessing, and the blessing is, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but rather Israel, for you have striven or struggled with men and with gods, and you have prevailed. And for me, all the different strands of Jewish experience entail struggling or striving in some way with the idea of God, whether God exists or not. That could be your form of striving. Does God exist or not? With what God wants, that could be your striving. What does God want? With one another. And I think that striving, importantly, is a striving that takes place within the framework of family and therefore of love. Because the family is where we get our first experiences of love, but the family is also where we get our first experiences of struggle. And in fact, all the biblical patriarchal stories and matriarchal stories, because the matriarchs in the stories at least are just as important as the patriarchs, are all stories of intense family struggle. None of them has a healthy family life. Like, not even close. Incredibly intense, and if there's a beloved child, there's a hated child, and they will struggle, and they'll struggle over generations. And it's each and every it's a multi-generational struggle. And the Bible's not ashamed of that. It's putting it right out there, and there's a reason these stories are in the Bible. These are the myths that are meant to undergird what it is to be an Israelite. And so to be an Israelite is to be locked in this love struggle with one another and with God. And I'll just say, you might say, well, Noah, that's a very nice midrash, but why would anyone want to be involved with that? And I will just say, I agree, this is not a good marketing strategy. And it's one of the reasons that there are, fewer than 20 million Jews probably alive today. Part of that is the Holocaust, but even if accounting for the losses of the Holocaust, there wouldn't be 100 million Jews. But there are, 1.5 billion Muslims or more, and 1.5 billion Christians or more, and 1 billion plus Buddhists or more. That's not a coincidence. It has a lot to do with the fact that it's much more appealing to think of God as love, or God as mercy, or the Buddha as a being capable of achieving enlightenment. And Judaism doesn't give you that. Its best human heroes are deeply flawed. Moses, David, Sarah, deeply, deeply flawed according to the biblical account. And the God, at least of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, is not calm, is not happy, expresses the divine voice as a voice of jealousy sometimes, of rage sometimes, of pain and sadness, and also of love. So, the kind of person who would want to belong to a faith tradition that says this is the best you can hope for is someone who has an inclination that maybe what you want in your spiritual life is something that matches what you know from your real life, where it's impossible to have love without some struggle. And as I say, that's not the most inspiring possible picture. It's more inspiring to imagine a spiritual dimension which is so much better, so much purer than the way we actually live our lives.
A lot of questions have been sent along, and you're welcome to submit more. I want us to now turn to the portion of your book that is about Israel. You argue that the state of Israel and a contested set of ideas about that state have become a fundamental component of Jewish life, thought, and experience, even for Jews who might prefer otherwise. I found this a very original part, an insightful part of your book. And I wonder if you can say more about your analysis, particularly the observation that some Jews are skeptical of this link between Jewish identity and the state of Israel.
Yeah. Well, it didn't happen overnight. at all. But over the years, say, starting in the middle of the 1970s, American Jews first started to come to terms with the Holocaust, which was so overwhelmingly horrifying that it was effectively repressed in public discourse for most American Jews until then. And then with the rise of the State of Israel. And those two events came to be linked in a complex theology in which the suffering of the Holocaust, which is incomprehensible in many forms of theology, came to be linked with the redemptive possibility of Israel. And that's a familial religious association in pretty much every religious tradition. If there's suffering, you're looking for redemption. And not for nothing, but that's also the basic structure of, say, mainstream, mainline Christianity. There's Christ's passion and Christ's resurrection, and one stands for the suffering and the other stands for the redemption. It's not an accident that theology itself comes out of Jewish thought in some ancient way. So in that frame, Israel's existence started to be imbued with something more than just, this is a state where you could go if things got bad. It's that as well for many Jews. But it rose a dimension higher, in a sense, to give some meaning to the suffering of the Holocaust. And I think it's against that backdrop that my generation of Jews was raised with the idea that Israel was really central to what it meant to be Jewish, so that if you went to a synagogue or a temple, you might see an Israeli flag in the front alongside an American flag. And then gradually, rituals of Jewish life started to be enhanced, as it were, to include Israel. So the birthright trip is an interesting example. It didn't exist when I was a kid. And today, I don't know what the numbers are, but a very significant number of young American Jews go on what is essentially a free trip to Israel to have an experience of being Jewish and being in connection with the Jewish state. Now, the birthright program can be and has been subject to withering criticisms, as well as enormous praise, and I think that depends on your political perspective. But its reality, its social reality, it's a demonstration of a certain kind of ritual practice that's connected to American Jewish life. And I could give you lots of other examples, but that sort of captures it.
Yes.
And so what's striking to me is that through that transformation, it becomes really difficult to appear in a synagogue or temple on, say, the high holidays, on, say, one of the big days of the year where they fill all the seats. The only day where they fill the seats outside of an Orthodox synagogue, which might fill the seats almost every week. And imagine that after a year like the year that followed October 7, that there would be a rabbi who would get up and give sermons that had nothing to do with Israel at all. It starts to become almost unimaginable outside the most ultra-Orthodox environment. And even on the very far left, the rabbi, in a synagogue where most people feel very critical of Israel, and those exist, the rabbi would be expected to give a sermon that was therefore engaged with Israel and perhaps was critical of Israel. And that's the kind of observation that makes you see the centrality of it. And then the last thing I would just say is, and this is, to me, this is an important explanatory feature of the book, and I didn't have to explain this before October 7, but then it's happened. For young Jews who were very active in, Students for Justice in Palestine or Jewish Voices for Peace, who have been involved, certainly since October 7th, but also before, in just a withering critique of Israel, including in some cases of Israel's even right to exist, depending on who you're talking to. For them, they are doing so through the lens of their commitment to progressive social justice Judaism. So their Judaism entails, and they will say this, you can read their websites or listen to them at their protests or read their articles. For them, their Judaism is their criticism of Israel. So you might ask, okay, great that you have this social justice commitment, and there are all these other places in the world where social justice could be committed, and all kinds of problems right here in our country that could be, and people are still focused on that, but for a lot of those folks, the core of their Jewishness is their engagement with Israel from a place of critique. And that, to me, is really fascinating and noteworthy, especially because there are those in the Jewish community who are more supportive of Israel who would say that those young Jews are self-hating. And I keep on saying, that's not what's going on. Self-hatred is characteristic of a weak or scared minority, not a powerful, confident minority. And what's going on there is it's a scathing form of self-critique, but it is a form of self-critique. And for those Jews, they think of it as continuous with civil rights marches.
Okay, so let's continue on the theme of prominent Jews who are deeply critical of Israel based on their views about Palestinian personhood and statehood. I'm thinking of commentators like Ezra Klein, David Remnick, but I want to quote Peter Beinart, who is a liberal Zionist, as he describes
I think
himself.
he may have dropped the Zionist, but he was a liberal Zionist until very recently, yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
I stand corrected.
No.
Good job.
But he was when I was writing the book. And I think what I said in the book is, I was quoting something he wrote when he was still calling himself a liberal Zionist. It's a journey, like it has been for everybody.
Well, I imagine.
Sorry, I'm not interrupting.
No. I imagine, although I don't know, that the reaction to some of the things he's been saying might have pushed him to describe himself in a different way.
Yeah.
So here's the part of a piece in the New York Times that I want you to comment on. In years to come, he wrote, American Jews will face growing pressure to choose between liberalism and Zionism. And I'm very curious about your reaction to the argument that Jews are at a crossroads, or other people talk about rupture and so forth.
Yeah. So first of all, yes, that's very symptomatic. I mean, that quote is symptomatic of the tension that I'm describing. And Peter's a fascinating example of that. You know, he also we both grew up in Cambridge. We're a year apart in age. He gradually became more and more religious. I got less and less religious. We kind of crossed somewhere in the middle. He identified very strongly as a very committed liberal Zionist, and then came to believe over time that constitutional liberal values are incompatible with the currently existing state of Israel. I guess my view is that the jury is still out on whether the divergence that he's describing will become inevitable. You know, within Israel, in the year before October 7, there was an intense internal debate that ripped the country apart, with hundreds of thousands of people on the streets, probably millions in total, over how much of a liberal constitutional democracy Israel was going to be. And, roughly speaking, half the people seemed to think less would be okay, less constitutional liberal, and about roughly half the people seem to think more constitutional liberal democracy would be desirable. So it's contested even within Israel. So a lot of the inevitability of what he's describing turns on one's expectations about how that debate is going. That's the first point. So if that debate turns out in a way where the forces that are less oriented towards constitutional liberalism prevail, and by the way, just to be clear, we just had our own election, unclear what's going to prevail in our country either. So I just want to be clear, I'm not, throwing stones. Our situation isn't identical, but in this respect is not dissimilar. But if it goes in a less liberal direction, then Peter is right. The other component goes to definitions. If you define Israel as Israel within its 1967 borders, or its 1967 borders plus the Golan Heights in Jerusalem, which Israel has annexed, so then use Israel's own definition of its borders, then I think it's still entirely credible to describe Israel as a constitutional liberal democracy, because people within those borders enjoy political and civil rights. And it doesn't mean that they're perfect. It doesn't mean there isn't discrimination against people of Arab descent, because there is. But in the United States, we also have structural racism and the legacy of our own, call it a genocide or not, it's up to you, of Native Americans. We're not living in some perfect liberal democratic, world either, and frankly, neither is any country. So I think within those borders, one could make that case. If, however, you include in the definition of Israel Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank, and when I say occupied West Bank, I'm literally just using the terminology that the Israeli government in its legal form uses. It's not the popular political formulation, but under Israeli law, under the Israeli High Court's jurisprudence, the West Bank is occupied. Gaza is a more complicated situation, but if you include just folks in the West Bank, you can't call Israel a liberal democracy, because then you have, almost a couple of million people who don't have political rights and whose civil rights are very severely circumscribed. So some of it is definitional in that regard too. And that depends on, will we get a two-state solution? Is there an alternative picture available? And if there isn't, and then you start to define Israel as every person, living between the river and the sea, then it's a lot harder to say, oh, Israel is a functional liberal democracy. So that becomes a complex and highly contested political fight.
Right. Very helpful. Thank you. I also want to ask you about an article that you published in Time magazine this spring, where you wrote that the whole such subject of anti-Semitism needs to be approached with charity and sensitivity. In that spirit, you discussed what you described as the phenomenon of considering Jews not a historically oppressed people seeking self-preservation, but instead oppressors. And I wonder if you can say more about your reactions to that development.
Usually I like to say thank you for a question. That's a really hard one, but I'll answer it because I did write the piece. So what I was trying to do with nuance and charity in the piece was to observe that it's entirely possible to be a deep critic of the state of Israel, and maybe even a foundational critic, maybe even someone who thinks it would be better if the state of Israel had never come into existence, without that making you an anti-Semite. I don't think those things are interchangeable, although some people disagree with me. But also at the same time, that it is possible, when advocating for that point of view, pretty easily to cross over into structures of argument that turn into identifiable or familiar anti-Semitism. And the point that I tried to locate at which that happens is when one starts to say that Jews per se are structurally in the position of oppressors. And, given the recency of the Holocaust, that position is, as a factual matter, to my mind, indefensible and obviously wrong. And it's sometimes coupled with the idea of Jews as white, and because Jews are white, it would follow they're in the structural position of oppressors. That could be true for Jews living in the United States after whiteness was assigned to Jews, which, depending on how you count, happened sometime in the 1950s, maybe even a little later, but is not applicable in the same way in Israel for what should be obvious reasons. Jewish ethnicity isn't marked by race in the same way in Israel. And then at the most literal level, there are lots of people who are Jews who do not self-identify as white. And so it's the structural claim that starts to resonate with the historical form of anti-Semitism, in which the anti-Semite projects onto Jews whatever preoccupation he, the anti-Semite, has, and says that's what the Jews are. And in that form, Jews can be literally anything. Jews can be at once the archetypal capitalists and the archetypal Bolshevik communists. And you sort of want to say you can have one or the other. You can't really have both. And there's lots and lots of examples of this. But the idea that the Jew as a structural figure is the oppressor sounds a lot like a tradition of anti-Semitism with its origins in Christianity that persisted right up, into the modern era, and is very unpopular now in the sense, which is a good thing. No one would walk around saying it in exactly, almost no one would go around saying that in exactly those terms. But it's possible to continue those narratives and discourses, and sometimes even to do so without knowing you're doing it. And that's what I mean about charity. It's entirely possible for someone to espouse views that I would say, on balance, I'd say, hey, I'm sorry. I think if we trace your view and contextualize it, it's anti-Semitic. But it might be that that person would say, I have no idea that that was the case, or I didn't intend for that to be the case.
Very, very helpful. Thank you for that. I have lost track of time we have in our conversation, and we should move quickly to audience questions. There are quite a few, as I mentioned. I want to start with a question from a current Kennedy School student related to campus climate. And question is, do you have any suggestions about how to manage conversations about Israel and Judaism as a student at Harvard?
I would start by referring people to Tomiko's committee's report on open inquiry, which is a hugely important document which everyone should read, even though it came out in the middle of the semester when people aren't so good at reading things, that lays down principles for how to engage in difficult and challenging conversations. The first principle is civility. The second is respect for the dignity of other people. And the third, and I'm paraphrasing here, is don't hold back. You need to be able to articulate the content of your views. Hiding from difficult conversations does not advance our objectives as an educational institution.
That's right.
So you have to say what you believe and engage in a way that is simultaneously respectful in your disagreement. That's assuming there is a disagreement, which often there will be on these topics. And I often think, we're sort of stuck between disrespectful or non-civil discourse, which isn't very helpful, or on the alternative side, people just saying, let's not talk about it at all because it'll get out of hand. Both of those outcomes are bad. So the first thing I would say to the student is have the conversation, but do it by sitting down, designating a time and a place for that conversation, whether privately or publicly, and beginning by laying down, I respect you, I respect your dignity, I respect your sincerity, I know you're coming from a place of wanting to make the world as good as it can be by your lights, and now I want to hear what you have to say, and I will listen respectfully, and I would like you to listen to me, and then maybe we'll go somewhere from there. It sounds like it should be obvious, but we live in a university and in a world where we always need to be reminded of that, and the reason for that is we're a bubble by design. A university should be a bubble to some degree, in a good way, but our bubble was burst in the last year as we as a university came to be actors in the news in some way. And when that happens, it makes it much harder for us to have meaningful conversations, because then we all think, oh, I'm a political actor. If what I say on campus is going to be in the New York Times, maybe I'm just like a politician. And the job of politicians is not, sadly, to sit around having thoughtful, reasoned conversations. I wish it were, but that's not their job. It is our job. That's the whole point of our job. We don't deserve to have the jobs that we have if we don't do that. So that's the challenge.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question. In your remarks today, you mentioned the phrase bad Jew in reference to your galley proofs. One of our attendees wonders why this concept is so central to much of Jewish self-conception.
Yeah, thank you. I had a whole riff on this in the earlier draft, which is on the cutting room floor, but when people say so first of all, I almost never hear anyone saying that someone else is a bad Jew. Bad Jew is an ironizing phrase, a kind of silly, humorous thing that people say but maybe not that much of a joke, that they say about themselves. Oh gosh, I didn't go to temple this year, I'm such a bad Jew. Oh man, that pork chop looks so good, I'm such a bad Jew, And my response to that is, it's funny, and I think it's good to be funny, but a person who's doing that is not a bad Jew. They're just being self-aware, a little self-ironizing, acknowledging their struggle about how Jewish they want to be. In other words, they're just being a Jew. So that, to me, is the thing about that phrase. It's a great phrase insofar as it captures, or could capture under the right circumstances, a slightly lighthearted, self-aware realization that we aspire to be engaged with Jewishness. And maybe we don't exactly succeed in that, and that's okay too. So again, in normal circumstances, I actually think there's something good about that. But what I said in the original version of my book is, don't call yourself a bad Jew. You're not a bad Jew. It's not that big a deal. You want to be funny about it, that's fine, but you're not actually a bad Jew if you have this ambivalence or engagement. You're just doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Another audience member wants to know your view on whether Jewish identity is inherently oppositional, including to existing power structures and majorities.
That's a really deep and hard question. Israelite identity, before there was Jewish identity, was not inherently oppositional, I don't think. I mean, the Israelites had other nations around them, and they weren't necessarily members of those nations, but that didn't make it inherently oppositional. Jewishness as a concept emerged in dialogue with early Christianity, and then after that with Christianity and with Islam. And in those senses, it got some oppositionality for the simple reason that the foundational myths of Christianity and Islam are bound up with Jewishness. That's also one reason that we're not going to ever see the end of anti-Semitism. It's because those myths are inherently intertwined. You know, in China, to a first approximation, no one's anti-Semitic because the foundational myths of China have literally nothing to do with the Jews one way or the other. So there's just no reason to be bound up in that. So there is a way that there's something oppositional about being Jewish in that you're at least not a Christian or a Muslim, you're something else. And Jews are also a little oppositional to themselves, so there's some oppositionality there too. So to that degree, I would say yes. The way that the answer, I think, still is no, is that you can be in struggle without being in opposition. So you can be in, and think of your family in this way. You can be in struggle with your family without being opposed to your family. It would be strange to say, I'm opposed to my brother. Maybe if you're fighting over control of a family business or something. You know, maybe on succession, the brothers and the sisters are opposed. But otherwise, you're not opposed, you're just in a struggle some of the time, and you also love. And that's also the biblical picture and the Jewish picture of the relationship to God. It's not that the Jewish people are opposed to God or God's opposed to the Jewish people. It's that they're supposed to love each other. They do love each other and they're supposed to love each other, but it's the kind of love that comes with strife. And so I think there's something about Jewishness that is about struggle within love, but I don't think that has to be oppositional struggle.
Very good. Another question. The word genocide is often mentioned in discussions of the Middle East. Do you agree with its use, or is there a more accurate alternative in your view?
Well, you know, genocide gets used in a bunch of different ways with respect to specifically with respect to Israel's relationship to the Palestinians. Certainly in the Gaza war post-October 7, the calls to describe Israel's conduct in Gaza as a genocide have grown, and it's being litigated. That topic is being litigated in front of the International Court of Justice, so it's got an international legal dimension to it as well. The easy answer is the legal answer, and I'll make that, and then I'll give the harder answer. On the legal side, if you look at how international institutions have used the term genocide and the standards of proof that have been required to convict people of crimes of genocide in the Rwandan and post-Yugoslav special tribunals and in the International Criminal Court, I don't believe that Israel's conduct in Gaza meets that legal definition. I see the argument on the other side, and there are some public statements by Israeli officials that are, as we say in the law, bad facts, you know, on the side of the Israelis' defense. But I don't think that the conduct fits the definition of conduct intended to destroy the Palestinian people in whole or in part. Could that change in the future? Of course it's possible for it to change. It's not some immutable fact. I'm just describing the way I see it now. Outside of the legal context, you know, genocide means something much demotically or vernacularly, something much more like, are you trying to eliminate a people as a whole? And I think there are unquestionably some small number of people in Israel who are deeply devoted to that, and maybe some larger number of people who would be open to entertaining that if they thought that it was something Israel could get away with. But I don't think that it's the fundamental project of Zionism, at least of mainstream Zionism. And I don't think it's the fundamental project of the State of Israel. I think there's a profound struggle between Israelis and Palestinians for, to say the obvious, for the same piece of land. And in struggles like that, the wish to imagine that the other side is not there is part of human life on both sides. But that's not the same thing as a coordinated plan of killing off all of the other people in order to possess their land. And so I don't find it to be the most useful formula or the best formula for describing the struggle. In terms of alternatives, that's a very hard question. I do tend to think in terms of two competing nationalisms involved in a struggle that is political and ideological and sometimes geopolitical and sometimes very violent. But that's not a catchy term, you know? I mean, you might call it a struggle for national self-determination with two different groups, each seeking national self-determination in the same space. I think to a first approximation that gets it right.
We have time for just one last question, and It is this. An audience member would like to know what you're wearing on your left wrist and whether there is special significance to it.
These are mala beads. There are 108 of them. And I started, which comes out of Buddhist tradition and is associated with meditation practices. But it's also, the beads are no different really than an Islamic tasbih, which has 99 beads, but it's the same idea. Or a rosary of the kind that you might see in Eastern Orthodox practice or in Catholic practice. They're all connected to the same sets of meditative practice of recitation of a common word, and you use the beads to count the words. I started wearing it to go from the sublime to the ridiculous after coming back from Burning Man, where I went with my fiancée, because I had the experience there of not being myself for a whole week. I got to be, I don't know who I was exactly, but it definitely wasn't me. And when I came back, I thought, what can I do to try to bring a little taste of that with me? And I started meditating, which was the least Noah Feldman thing that I could think of. And it actually has turned out to really mean something to me. And then I wanted a manifestation that was visible to remind myself of the possibility of just taking a small step back from the intensity of everything that exists in our lives. And I found the beads helpful for that. In a way, they're a kind of analog to the tzitzit, the ritual fringes in traditional Jewish practice. Those, the Bible says, you should look at them and not stray after your heart. The idea is that your heart's not taking you in the right place. And this isn't quite about straying, but it is about having a physical, visible reminder that you could take a deep breath now, and it wouldn't be the end of the world. And in the world that we live in, domestically, internationally, and every other way, I'm a sort of a believer that everyone should do whatever they can to take a little bit of a step back sometimes. And this one happens to work for me.
Excellent. I need some of those beads, I have to say. I am afraid we are out of time. Please join me in thanking Noah Feldman.
That concludes today's program.
Born Curious is brought to you by Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Our producer is Alan Grazioso. Kevin Grady, Anna Song, Lily Roberts, Emerson Prond, Max Doyle, and Cabin 3 Media provided editing and production support. Many thanks to Jane Huber for editorial support. And we are your co-hosts. I'm Evelisa Strada.
And I'm Heather Min.
Our website, where you can listen to all our episodes, is radcliffe.harvard.edu/borncurious.
If you have feedback, you can email us at info@radcliffe.harvard.edu.
You can follow Harvard Radcliffe Institute on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Threads. And as always, you can find Born Curious wherever you listen to podcasts.
Thanks for learning with us, and join us next time.